October 6, 1941, outside Mutsensk, Soviet Union, German General Guderian, Hitler's best tank commander, the man who pioneered Blitzkrieg, the military genius who'd smashed through France and Poland, writes something in his report that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Our tanks are inferior. 3 words that shattered German confidence, because the German army in 1941 was supposed to be invincible. They'd conquered most of Europe. Their panzer divisions had destroyed every army that faced them. German tank technology was considered the best in the world, and now in the mud of Russia, Guderian was admitting his tanks couldn't match Soviet T-34s. Here's what happened. German forces advancing on Moscow encountered Soviet tanks they'd never seen before, the T-34, and these Soviet tanks did something impossible. They shrugged off German anti-tank rounds that destroyed every other tank. German 37mm anti-tank guns bounced off the T-34's sloped armor. The rounds literally ricocheted. German tank crews watched in horror as their shots did nothing, while T-34 return fire penetrated German armor and killed crews. But it gets worse. The T-34s didn't just survive German fire, they drove through conditions that stopped German tanks completely. The wide tracks distributed weight so T-34s could cross mud and snow that bogged down German Panzers. The diesel engine kept running in 40 degrees Celsius cold that froze German gasoline engines, and when T-34s attacked, their 76mm guns destroyed German tanks from ranges German guns couldn't match. One German tank commander described it as fighting an enemy who could kill you from distances you couldn't kill them, whose armor your guns couldn't penetrate, who could drive through terrain you couldn't cross, and who appeared in numbers you couldn't match. This wasn't combat. This was slaughter. And here's the truly insane part. Soviet planners had designed the T-34 before the war started. They knew exactly what was coming. They knew they'd face German tanks. They knew they'd fight in Russian winter and spring mud. So they built a tank specifically designed to counter German advantages and exploit Russian conditions. And it worked so well that German generals were writing panicked reports just months into the invasion. The T-34 wasn't just a good tank, it was the perfect tank for the Eastern Front. Sloped armor that deflected shots instead of stopping them through thickness, wide tracks that provided mobility in mud and snow, a powerful gun that could kill any German tank, simple design that could be mass-produced by workers with minimal training, reliable mechanics that peasant soldiers could maintain, and most importantly, the Soviets could build them faster than Germans could destroy them. This is the story of how one weapon changed World War II. Not through technological sophistication, the T-34 was actually simpler than German tanks in many ways. Not through superior crew training, Soviet tank crews in 1941-42 were often poorly trained. But through brilliant design philosophy, build a tank that's good enough, can be produced in enormous numbers, and is specifically optimized for the conditions where it will fight. While Germany was building complicated, expensive tanks that required skilled crews and constant maintenance, the Soviet Union was mass-producing T-34s that were simple, reliable, and deadly. While German tanks broke down in Russian winter, T-34s kept rolling. While German factories struggled to replace losses, Soviet factories were churning out hundreds of T-34s per month. By 1945, the Soviet Union had produced approximately 57,000 T-34s. 57,000. Germany's most produced tank, the Panzer IV, totaled about 8,500. The Tiger Wonders, which Germans considered their answer to the T-34, they built 1,347. The entire German tank production for the entire war was roughly 50,000 vehicles of all types. The Soviets built more T-34s alone than Germany built tanks total. And these weren't just sitting in reserve. They were in combat, attacking, destroying German forces, rolling west from Stalingrad to Kursk to Warsaw to Berlin. The T-34 became the symbol of Soviet tank forces, the weapon that broke the Wehrmacht's back and drove them out of Russia. German response to the T-34 reveals how badly it shocked them. They tried copying it, several proposals for German tanks using T-34 design features. They tried countering it, developing the Panther tank specifically to match T-34 capabilities. They tried destroying production, bombing Soviet factories which just scattered production to locations beyond bomber range. Nothing worked. The T-34s kept coming. This isn't a story about Soviet technical superiority. Soviet engineering in many areas lagged behind Germany's. This is a story about design philosophy. The Soviets understood that winning wars requires weapons that can be produced in massive numbers, maintained in field conditions, operated by conscript soldiers, and designed for the specific environment where they'll fight. The T-34 embodied all of these principles. German tanks didn't. German tanks were over-engineered marvels. Individual Tigers could dominate battlefields when working properly, but working properly required skilled crews, constant maintenance, spare parts that weren't available, fuel that was scarce, and logistics that Germany couldn't sustain. The T-34 was under-engineered brilliance. It wasn't perfect. Crew conditions were terrible. Early models had significant flaws, but it worked. It was simple, it could be mass-produced, and there were always more T-34s. Let me show you how this one tank changed the entire war, how German tankers learned to fear the distinctive sound of T-34 engines, how Soviet factories scattered across the Urals produced tanks faster than Germany could destroy them, how simplicity and mass production defeated sophistication and quality, and how the T-34 became the blueprint for military equipment design that's still relevant today. Good enough, producible in quantity, optimized for conditions of use, beats technically superior but rare weapons every time. The T-34 didn't accidentally become the best tank of World War II. Soviet designers made specific choices based on lessons from previous conflicts and predictions about future warfare. Every feature that made German generals panic was intentional. Sloped armor, physics over thickness. Traditional tank design used thick, vertical armor, stop shells through sheer mass of steel. The T-34 used a radically different approach, sloped the armor at extreme angles. A 45mm plate angled at 60 degrees provides protection equivalent to 90 mm of vertical armor because shells hit at an angle and ricochet instead of penetrating straight through. This was revolutionary. The T-34's front armor was only 45mm thick, less than German heavy tanks, but angled at 60 degrees it was effectively immune to most German anti-tank weapons in 1941. German 37mm anti-tank guns, standard equipment for infantry, literally could not penetrate T-34 armor from any angle. Rounds bounced off. German tank crews reported firing multiple shots at T-34s with no effect before the Soviet tank destroyed them. The sloped armor had another advantage: weight savings. Providing equivalent protection with angled thin armor instead of vertical thick armor meant the T-34 weighed less than comparable German tanks, which improved mobility and reduced strain on mechanical components. Soviet designers traded armor thickness for armor effectiveness, and won that trade decisively. Wide tracks, mobility in Russian conditions. The Eastern Front's terrain was notoriously difficult. Spring and fall brought Rasputitsa, the mud season, when roads became impassable and cross-country movement turned into nightmare. German tanks, designed for European roads and firm ground, bogged down constantly. Their narrow tracks sank into mud. Crews spent more time digging out stuck tanks than fighting. The T-34 had tracks almost twice as wide as comparable German tanks. This distributed weight over a much larger surface area, dramatically reducing ground pressure. The T-34 could drive across mud, snow, and soft ground that stopped German tanks completely. This gave Soviet forces mobility advantages in exactly the conditions where they fought most frequently. German tank crews hated this. They'd see T-34s driving across terrain they couldn't traverse, flanking positions they thought were secure, appearing from directions they thought were impassable. The wide tracks turned Russian weather from an obstacle affecting both sides into a Soviet advantage. Diesel engine, reliability and safety. Most tanks in 1941 used gasoline engines. The T-34 used a diesel V2 engine. This choice had multiple advantages that became critical on the Eastern Front. Diesel doesn't freeze as easily as gasoline. In Russian winter, temperatures dropped to 40 degrees or colder. German gasoline engines froze solid. Crews had to build fires under their tanks to warm engines before starting, a process that took hours and revealed positions to enemy forces. T-34 diesel engines started reliably in extreme cold. Diesel is less flammable than gasoline. When tanks were hit and fuel tanks ruptured, gasoline tanks often caught fire, burning crews alive. Diesel was harder to ignite. T-34 crews had better survival rates when tanks were penetrated because fuel didn't turn their vehicle into an instant crematorium. Diesel was also more fuel efficient, giving the T-34 longer range than comparable gasoline tanks. And critically for Soviet logistics, diesel fuel was easier to supply because many Soviet tractors and industrial vehicles used diesel, creating existing supply chains. The 76mm gun killing power. The T-34's initial 76.2mm gun could penetrate any German tank in 1941 from normal combat ranges. German tanks couldn't return the favor. This gave T-34 crews the tactical initiative. They could engage German tanks from distances. German guns couldn't effectively penetrate T-34 armor. Later war models upgraded to an 85mm gun when Germans introduced heavier tanks. The constant upgradability of the T-34 design meant Soviet forces could improve their main weapon without designing entirely new tanks. They just modified the existing design. Simplicity, production and maintenance. German tanks were complex, precision engineered, required skilled workers to build and skilled mechanics to maintain. The Tiger tank transmission was so complicated that crews needed specialized training just to shift gears properly. Repairs required specialized parts that were often unavailable. The T-34 was deliberately simple. Components were designed for ease of production. Tolerances were loose. Parts didn't fit precisely but worked adequately. Welding was rough but effective. Crews could perform most maintenance with basic tools. Damaged components could often be hammered back into shape or field repaired rather than requiring replacement. This simplicity had costs. Crew comfort was terrible. Visibility was poor. Internal layout was cramped. Early models had transmission issues that required experienced drivers. But the tank worked, could be built quickly by workers with minimal training, and could be maintained by conscript soldiers in field conditions. The production miracle, building 57,000 tanks. When Germany invaded in June 1941, they captured or destroyed much of Soviet Western industrial capacity. Tank factories in Ukraine and Western Russia were overrun. Soviet tank production should have collapsed. Instead, the Soviets did something unprecedented. They moved entire factories, disassembled equipment, loaded it on trains, evacuated workers and their families, moved hundreds of miles east beyond German bomber range, and reassembled production facilities in the Urals and Siberia. Factories were producing tanks again within months of relocating. The T-34's simple design made this possible. Complex machinery requiring precision manufacturing would have been impossible to move and restart. The T-34's loose tolerances and simple construction meant factories could resume production with workers who'd never built tanks before, using equipment that had been disassembled and reassembled in facilities that were barely finished buildings. Soviet factories innovated constantly to increase production, automation where possible, simplified components, reduced machining, streamlined assembly. By 1943, Soviet factories were producing T-34s faster than Germans could destroy them. German intelligence estimated Soviet production at impossible levels, then captured documents proved the estimates were actually low. The numbers tell the story. In 1941, the Soviet Union produced about 3,000 T-34s despite losing major industrial areas. In 1942, 12,500. In 1943, 15,800. In 1944, 14,600. Total production, approximately 57,000 by war's end, plus thousands more produced after 1945. Germany's total tank production for the entire war was roughly 50,000 vehicles of all types. The Soviets built more T-34s alone. When you're fighting an enemy who can replace losses faster than you can inflict them, you've already lost. German response: too little, too late. Germans recognized the T-34's superiority quickly. Their responses reveal how thoroughly the T-34 had disrupted their plans. They tried capturing T-34s and using them. German forces did use captured Soviet tanks when available. They tried copying the design, proposed several tanks incorporating T-34 features. They developed the Panther tank specifically to counter the T-34, incorporating sloped armor and comparable firepower. But German responses were always too late and too few. The Panther arrived in 1943, 2 years after the T-34. Germany produced about 6,000 Panthers total. For every Panther, there were nearly 10 T-34s, and the Panther, while individually superior, was mechanically unreliable and expensive to produce, exactly the problems the T-34 design had avoided. The T-34 proved that superior numbers of good enough weapons beat smaller numbers of excellent weapons. This lesson changed military procurement philosophy permanently. The T-34's influence extends to modern military design. Build weapons that can be produced in quantity, maintained in field conditions, and operated by average personnel, rather than pursuing perfection that limits production and requires elite crews. Numbers and specifications mean nothing without battlefield performance. The T-34 didn't just look good on paper, it dominated actual combat repeatedly throughout the war. 3 battles demonstrate why German generals learned to fear Soviet tanks. Battle of Brody, June 1941. The T-34's combat debut, June 23, 1941. One day after Operation Barbarossa began, German and Soviet tank forces collided near Brody in Ukraine in one of the largest tank battles of the war's opening. Soviet forces included T-34s and KV-1 heavy tanks, the first time Germans encountered these new Soviet designs in large numbers. German tank crews experienced shock. Their standard 37mm anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate T-34 or KV-1 armor. Panzer IIIs and IVs, Germany's main battle tanks, found their shells ineffective. German units reported Soviet tanks driving through their positions, immune to fire, destroying German vehicles with impunity. One famous incident involved a single KV-2 heavy tank blocking a road. German forces threw everything at it: anti-tank guns, tank fire, artillery, even engineers with demolition charges. Nothing worked for over a day. The KV-2 destroyed dozens of German vehicles before finally being knocked out. This was Soviet armor doctrine in action. Build tanks that can survive concentrated fire and break through enemy lines. The battle was ultimately a German tactical victory because Soviet forces were poorly coordinated and many tanks were destroyed when they ran out of fuel or ammunition rather than being penetrated by German fire. But German commanders recognized they faced a serious problem. Soviet tank technology had surpassed their own. Reports flowed back to high command. "We need better tanks immediately." Battle of Kursk, July 1943, the largest tank battle ever. Kursk was Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. Hitler gambled everything on breaking Soviet defenses in a massive pincer attack. Germans assembled their best equipment, Tiger and Panther tanks, Ferdinand tank destroyers, new aircraft. This would be Germany's revenge for Stalingrad, the battle that would turn the Eastern Front around. It failed catastrophically, and the T-34 was a major reason why. Soviet forces at Kursk included approximately 5,000 tanks and assault guns, with T-34s forming the backbone. They were dug in, defended in depth, positioned in kill zones where German attacks would face concentrated fire. When Germans attacked, they walked into a slaughter. The Germans had numerical disadvantages but believed their superior technology would compensate. Tiger tanks could kill T-34s from long range. Panthers had comparable capabilities to T-34s, but better crew ergonomics and optics. This should have worked. It didn't. For every German advantage in individual tank quality, Soviets had advantages in numbers, defensive preparation, and operational depth. German tanks bogged down in minefields, were ambushed by dug-in T-34s, and faced waves of Soviet armor that kept coming despite horrific losses. The numbers from Kursk are staggering. Germany lost approximately 760 tanks and assault guns, nearly half their committed armor. Soviet losses were far higher in absolute numbers, approximately 1,600 tanks destroyed. But Soviets could replace losses. Germans couldn't. After Kursk, Germany never launched another major offensive in the east. The strategic initiative passed permanently to Soviet forces. The T-34's contribution at Kursk wasn't individual superiority. German heavy tanks could destroy T-34s effectively when conditions favored them. The T-34's contribution was being available in numbers that made German tactical advantages irrelevant. When 5 T-34s attack one Tiger, the Tiger might destroy 3 or 4 before being knocked out. Germany couldn't afford those exchange rates. The Soviet Union could. Operation Bagration, June-August 1944. The T-34 offensive Operation Bagration was the Soviet offensive that destroyed German Army Group Center, the largest single defeat of German forces in the entire war. Over 400,000 German casualties, 28 divisions destroyed, German defensive lines shattered across hundreds of miles, and T-34s led the breakthrough. Soviet tactics had evolved. Instead of human wave attacks that earlier war stereotypes suggest, Soviets used sophisticated combined arms operations. Artillery preparation, followed by tank attacks exploiting breakthrough points, with mechanized infantry supporting. The T-34 provided the mobile firepower that Soviet doctrine required. What made this particularly devastating was that by 1944, Soviet crews had learned to use T-34s effectively. Early war T-34s were often squandered through poor tactics and inadequate crew training. By 1944, Soviet tankers had years of experience. They knew how to employ their vehicles' strengths, mobility, firepower, numbers, while minimizing weaknesses. German forces couldn't stop the advance. They lacked fuel for counterattacks. They lacked reserves. They lacked the numerical strength to establish defensive lines against an enemy who could concentrate overwhelming force at breakthrough points. The T-34s drove deep into German rear areas, destroying logistics, encircling units, creating pockets that were systematically destroyed. One German soldier's account describes watching Soviet tanks appear on the horizon like a sea, hundreds of T-34s advancing in formation, firing as they moved, supported by aircraft and artillery. Individual German tanks could achieve local victories, but you can't defeat an ocean by winning against individual waves. By August 1944, Soviet forces had advanced hundreds of kilometers, liberated Belarus, and reached Poland. The path to Berlin was open, and T-34s led every major attack for the next 9 months until the war ended. The psychological impact. German tankers' fear. Numbers don't capture the psychological impact of facing T-34s. German tankers knew that Soviet tanks were more reliable than theirs in winter, that Soviet tanks could traverse terrain theirs couldn't, that for every German tank there were 5 or 10 T-34s, that even if they destroyed several Soviet tanks, more would keep coming. This knowledge affected morale and decision-making. German tank crews became cautious, defensive, reluctant to take risks that might result in their destruction when they knew they couldn't be replaced. Soviet tankers, knowing reserves existed and that damaged tanks would be replaced, could afford aggressive tactics that traded losses for territorial gains. The battles proved what the design promised: a tank that's good enough, produced in overwhelming numbers, optimized for conditions where it fights, beats individually superior but rare opponents. This lesson has influenced military procurement ever since. The T-34 established the template: mass production, adequate capability, operational reliability, beats technical sophistication every time. The T-34's dominance wasn't about Soviet engineering superiority. Soviet manufacturing in many areas lagged behind Germany's. The T-34 succeeded because Soviet designers understood something German engineers didn't. Wars are won in factories and supply depots as much as battlefields. The German problem: over-engineering. German tanks were masterpieces of precision engineering. The Tiger I had interleaved road wheels for smooth ride. The Panther had sophisticated optics. The King Tiger had armor so thick it was nearly invincible frontally. These were technically impressive vehicles that performed excellently when working properly with trained crews and adequate support. But when working properly was the problem. German tanks required specialized parts that were difficult to manufacture and replace, skilled mechanics for maintenance and repair, high-quality fuel that became increasingly scarce, experienced crews to operate complex systems, extensive logistical support that Germany couldn't sustain. A Tiger tank transmission was so complex that improper shifting could destroy it. Crew training took weeks just to learn proper operation. When transmissions failed, which they did frequently, the tank needed specialized parts and skilled mechanics. In combat conditions on the Eastern Front, these requirements were often impossible to meet. German factories couldn't produce tanks fast enough to replace losses. Precision manufacturing takes time. Skilled workers were increasingly drafted for combat. Allied bombing destroyed factories and scattered production. By 1944, German tank production was a fraction of what was needed. The result: German forces had individually superior tanks that broke down constantly, couldn't be repaired in field conditions, consumed fuel they didn't have, and couldn't be replaced when destroyed. Technical superiority meant nothing when most tanks were broken or couldn't be fielded due to logistical constraints. The Soviet solution: adequate is enough. The T-34 was deliberately designed to avoid every problem that plagued German tanks. Soviet engineers asked, "What's the minimum required for combat effectiveness?" Then they built that. Armor didn't need to be thick if it was well angled. The T-34 had less armor than German heavy tanks, but slope designs provided comparable protection at lighter weight. Components didn't need precision fit if loose tolerances still worked. T-34 parts were stamped and welded with rough edges and imperfect fit, but they functioned. This meant faster production with less skilled workers. Maintenance didn't need specialized tools if the design was simple. T-34 crews could perform most repairs with basic equipment. Damaged components could often be field repaired rather than replaced. Crew comfort didn't matter if the tank was effective. The T-34's interior was cramped, uncomfortable, and difficult to work in. But crew comfort wasn't the priority. Fighting effectiveness was. This philosophy extended to production. Soviet factories weren't trying to build perfect tanks. They were trying to build functional tanks quickly. Quality control was loose. Early T-34s had significant defects, but a tank with defects that still fights is better than a perfect tank that takes twice as long to build. The numbers game: quantity has a quality. All its own Stalin allegedly said, "Quantity has a quality all its own." The T-34 proved this. Yes, a Tiger tank could destroy 3 or 4 T-34s before being knocked out, but if the Soviet Union fields 10 T-34s for every Tiger, the math favors the Soviets. The Tiger crew might have a successful engagement, destroying multiple enemies, but they'll eventually be overwhelmed. And when that one Tiger is destroyed, Germany can't replace it quickly. The 6 or 7 T-34s that survive will be replaced within weeks. This arithmetic dominated the Eastern Front. German tanks won many individual engagements. German tankers had higher kill ratios, but ratios don't matter when the enemy can afford losses and you can't. The T-34's greatest strength wasn't individual capability. It was being available in numbers that made German tactical superiority irrelevant. The reliability factor. Tanks that keep fighting. The Eastern Front's conditions were brutal. Extreme cold in winter, extreme heat in summer, spring and fall mud, dusty plains, forests, urban ruins. Tanks needed to function in all these environments with minimal maintenance. German tanks failed this requirement. They broke down frequently. The Panther's final drive was notoriously unreliable. Many Panthers were lost to mechanical failure rather than enemy action. Tigers consumed enormous amounts of fuel and broke down regularly. German forces spent as much time recovering and repairing broken tanks as fighting with functional ones. The T-34 wasn't perfect. Early models had transmission problems. The diesel engine was loud. Mechanical parts wore out, but the tank was reliable enough for operational use. It started in cold weather. It kept running despite rough treatment. When components failed, crews could often fix them without specialized support. The T-34's reliability meant more tanks were combat-ready more of the time. The production advantage: factories as weapons. While German engineers were designing more sophisticated tanks, Soviet factories were perfecting mass production. Every efficiency improvement meant more tanks per month, stamped parts instead of cast, welded armor instead of machined, simplified components with fewer parts, automated assembly where possible. By 1943, Soviet factories could build a T-34 in less time than it took German factories to build a Panzer, Germany's most produced tank, and simpler than Tigers or Panthers. Soviet production rates accelerated throughout the war, while German rates stagnated or declined. This created a situation where Germany was losing the war in factories before battles were even fought. No matter how many Soviet tanks German forces destroyed, more kept coming. German intelligence repeatedly underestimated Soviet production capacity because the numbers seemed impossible. They weren't. They were the result of prioritizing production efficiency over individual tank quality. The strategic lesson: design for reality. The T-34 succeeded because it was designed for the reality of industrial warfare on the Eastern Front. Soviet designers understood that wars are won by having enough weapons that work adequately rather than few weapons that work perfectly. They understood that tank crews would be conscripts with limited training, not elite veterans. They understood that maintenance would happen in field conditions without specialized equipment. They understood that Russian weather and terrain would destroy sophisticated machinery. German designers designed for an ideal war: trained crews, adequate logistics, proper maintenance facilities, sufficient fuel and parts. When the reality of the Eastern Front didn't match these assumptions, German tanks failed despite technical superiority. The T-34 was designed for the war that actually happened: adequate armor, adequate firepower, adequate crew ergonomics, but exceptional mobility, reliability, and producibility. This combination of good enough combat capability with exceptional operational and strategic advantages made it the most effective tank of World War II. Modern military planners still study this lesson. The most technically advanced weapon isn't necessarily the most effective. Effectiveness requires matching design to operational reality, prioritizing production capacity, ensuring maintainability, and accepting that good enough in quantity beats excellent in small numbers. The T-34 proved this principle, and in doing so changed how militaries think about weapons procurement forever. The T-34 outlived the Soviet Union. Production continued until the 1950s with over 80,000 built total. It saw combat in Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, Africa, and Yugoslavia. Some were still in service in the 21st century. No other World War II tank has remained militarily relevant for so long. But the T-34's legacy isn't its longevity, it's the design philosophy it represents. A philosophy that challenges fundamental assumptions about weapons development and military effectiveness. The Western military's T-34 moment. Before, American military planners in the 1970s-80s faced a strategic problem. The Soviet Union had numerical superiority in tanks and ground forces in Europe. If war came, NATO would face thousands of Soviet tanks. American strategy couldn't rely on matching numbers. The Soviet Union could field more tanks than NATO could destroy. The solution drew lessons from the T-34. Build weapons optimized for the conflict you'll actually fight, prioritize what matters operationally, accept trade-offs that improve the attributes that determine victory. The M1 Abrams tank incorporated T-34 philosophy updated for modern warfare. Survivable but not invincible, powerful enough to kill enemy armor reliably, mobile enough to maneuver effectively, and critically, reliable enough to maintain high operational readiness rates. The Abrams isn't the most heavily armored tank possible, or the most powerfully armed, but it's optimized for combined arms warfare with high availability rates. The forgotten lesson: why modern militaries still get this wrong. Despite the T-34's lessons, militaries still fall into the sophistication trap. Projects that prioritize technical advancement over operational utility, weapons that work brilliantly in ideal conditions but fail in actual combat environments. Procurement programs that produce small numbers of expensive, complex systems instead of larger numbers of simpler, reliable ones. The F-35 fighter program illustrates this pattern. Designed to do everything, master of none. Technically sophisticated but expensive, and with chronic reliability issues. Each F-35 costs over $100 million. For that price, you could buy multiple simpler aircraft optimized for specific roles. The F-35 is trying to be a precision instrument when military history suggests you need a reliable hammer. The T-34 philosophy would ask, what's the minimum capability required? How simple can we make it? How many can we build? How maintainable is it in field conditions? These aren't exciting questions. They don't generate enthusiasm among engineers or politicians, but they're the questions that determine whether weapons actually work in war. The eternal truth: logistics beats technology. German tanks at the end of World War II were the most advanced in the world. The King Tiger was nearly impervious frontally. The Panther had excellent mobility and firepower. German tank crews were experienced veterans. And Germany lost because they ran out of fuel, couldn't replace destroyed vehicles, and couldn't maintain the sophisticated machines they'd built. Soviet tanks in 1945 were less sophisticated but operated effectively because Soviet logistics could keep them fueled, maintained, and replaced when destroyed. The T-34 won not through technological superiority, but through sustainable operations at scale. Modern military planners still struggle with this truth. We're drawn to technological advancement, to sophisticated systems, to capabilities that sound impressive in briefings, but wars are won by boring things: supply chains that work, maintenance programs that keep equipment operational, production capacity that replaces losses, and weapons simple enough that average personnel can use them effectively. The design philosophy that changed everything. The T-34 established principles that define effective military equipment: optimization over maximization. Don't maximize any single attribute. Optimize the combination of attributes that matter for your operational environment. The T-34 didn't have the thickest armor or most powerful gun or best crew ergonomics, but the combination of adequate armor, adequate firepower, exceptional mobility, and high reliability was perfectly optimized for the Eastern Front. Producibility as a combat multiplier. A weapon's effectiveness includes how many you can build. A tank twice as good that takes 3 times as long to build is worse than the simpler tank because you'll have fewer of them. The T-34's simple design meant Soviet factories could build them in numbers that overwhelmed German forces regardless of individual tank superiority. Maintainability equals availability. The best weapon is useless if it's broken. Designed for field maintenance with basic tools by average mechanics. Accept reliability over peak performance. The T-34's crude but robust design meant more tanks were combat-ready more of the time compared to sophisticated German tanks that spent weeks in repair depots. Designed for actual users, your crews won't be elite experts. They'll be conscripts or average soldiers with limited training. Design systems they can operate effectively despite limited experience. The T-34's simple controls and forgiving handling meant even inexperienced crews could drive and fight effectively. Environmental optimization. Designed for the environment where the weapon will actually be used. The T-34 was specifically optimized for Russian conditions. German tanks were designed for European roads and temperate climate. When both fought in Russia, environmental optimization mattered more than technical sophistication. The question every procurement office should ask before approving any weapons program: ask these T-34 questions. Can we produce this in the quantities we'll actually need? Can average maintenance personnel keep it operational in field conditions? Can typical users operate it effectively with realistic training? Is it optimized for the environment where we'll use it? Does it prioritize the attributes that actually determine combat effectiveness? If the answer to any question is no, you're building a wonder weapon. Technically impressive, but operationally problematic. You're repeating Germany's mistakes instead of learning from the T-34's success. The final accounting. The T-34 wasn't perfect. Crew conditions were terrible. Visibility was poor. Early models had serious flaws. Individual German tanks often outperformed individual T-34s in direct combat. But the T-34 won because perfection wasn't the goal. Victory was the goal. And victory came from building enough weapons that worked adequately rather than few weapons that worked perfectly. From designing for the reality of industrial warfare rather than idealized combat. From accepting trade-offs that improved operational effectiveness even when they reduced technical sophistication. 57,000 T-34s rolled west from Stalingrad to Berlin. They broke the Wehrmacht's back. They proved that quantity, reliability, and operational optimization beat quality, sophistication, and technical advancement. They changed how we think about military equipment design forever. German generals called the T-34 indestructible. They were wrong. T-34s were destroyed by the thousands. But they were also right in a deeper sense. The T-34 concept was indestructible. The philosophy it represented, adequacy in quantity beats perfection in scarcity, has proven correct repeatedly throughout military history. The next time someone proposes a wonder weapon, a technically sophisticated system that will revolutionize warfare through technological advancement, remember the T-34. Remember that wars are won in factories and supply depots. Remember that reliability matters more than peak performance. Remember that good enough in overwhelming numbers beats perfect in inadequate quantities.